Welcome to Dwellings, a podcast from the City of San Jose Housing Department, where we talk with thought leaders about ending homelessness, building affordable housing, and key housing policies. I'm Jeff Scott, and I'll be your host for Season 4 of Dwellings. On today's episode, I'm joined by Gillian Adams, Principal Planner for the Association of Bay Area Governments, also known as ABAG. We'll be discussing ABAG's role in helping cities and counties in the Bay Area meet their housing requirements.
Thanks for having me today. I'm Gillian Adams. I'm a principal planner here at ABAG, which stands for the Association of Bay Area Governments. And we are the Council of Governments for the 9-county Bay Area. So an opportunity for local governments within the region to come together and discuss issues. And specifically for RHNA, that's kind of our state mandate to conduct the RHNA process. And so I was the project manager for our recently completed 6th cycle RHNA process, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And that's maybe my, I think, third opportunity to work on RHNA.
Well, great. And as you just said, RHNA is RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Did I get that right?
Yes, it's either assessment or allocation.
Can you tell us a little bit about RHNA? What exactly is it, and what is the mandate that cities have to comply with?
So RHNA is part of California state law. It's known as the Housing Element Law. It's existed since 1969, and the specific requirements, they do change over time. But at its core, the law requires all cities, towns, and the unincorporated counties in the state, all of California, to adequately plan to meet the housing needs of everyone in their community. And the RHNA is specifically the part of housing element law that's used to determine a minimum number of new houses and the affordability of those homes that each local government has to plan for in the housing element of their general plan. It's something that's done every 8 years. So the jurisdictions have either finished or are working on their housing elements that cover the period from 2023 to 2031.
When a city or town is trying to comply with RHNA, is there any construction mandate, building mandate that goes along with it, or is it strictly a planning exercise?
I guess what I would say is for RHNA specifically, it's a planning mandate. And so what jurisdictions are required to do in their housing element is to identify specific sites where they're going to either have zoning in place or going to change the zoning to accommodate the number of housing units that they've been assigned through the RHNA process. I will say that there are some laws that have been passed in the last several years that do take into account a jurisdiction's progress in meeting their RHNA goals. So for example, SB 35 is one where if a jurisdiction is sort of not making enough progress in meeting their RHNA numbers over the years, then they can be subject to SB 35, which is essentially allows, it's kind of complicated, but it basically requires that local governments use what's called a streamlined ministerial approval process, which essentially just removes some of the discretion, I guess I would say, for local governments. So ministerial just means that you're sort of answering yes or no questions. You don't have a lot of any discretion over the approval of a project that's proposed if it has a certain number of affordable units included in it.
I've read lately about something called the builder's remedy. When you talk about a ministerial approval or streamlined approval, are we talking about the builder's remedy, or is that something completely different?
They're actually two different things. But I would say they're similar ideas. So the builder's remedy is essentially that if a local government has not had its housing elements certified by the state, which is the State Department of Housing and Community Development, by a certain deadline, and the deadline for the Bay Area jurisdictions was January 31st of this year. So if a jurisdiction doesn't have a certified housing element, then the builder's remedy, which is part of a separate law called the Housing Accountability Act, it essentially has the same impact of removing some of the local government's ability to either sort of deny or change projects. And so it allows projects to be approved even if they're inconsistent with the jurisdiction's zoning.
This cycle has to happen every 8 years. What are the options when you start to run low on new space to build?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, most of the jurisdictions within the Bay Area are kind of getting to that point of they don't necessarily have vacant sites or vacant land that can be sort of converted to housing. So a lot of them are faced with increasing the amount of homes and maybe apartments that can be built on a particular parcel. There are other strategies such as accessory dwelling units. So that's kind of I think a lot of places are looking into that. So that's where you add, what's granny flats or things like that. So a backyard cottage or something like that. So thinking about ways to take, the existing sort of pattern of homes, which in a lot of cases is single family homes on, relatively large lots, and thinking about ways to increase the number of homes that are in that existing space, I guess I would say. A lot of cities are thinking about, not having places that are zoned exclusively for single family homes. So trying to allow for more duplexes or triplexes, small apartment buildings, which are some of the housing types that used to exist, but then were sort of outlawed in a lot of jurisdictions, and thinking about ways to, avoid sort of sprawling out and using up greenfield sites or agricultural land, and trying to increase the density within the places that have already been developed.
One of the things that I hear from people who perhaps oppose greater housing or greater density are arguments like, well, if we increase the density in an area that wasn't originally contemplated for that, we're going to run into issues like we're going to stretch our infrastructure too thin, or we're going to run out of parking, or we're going to overcrowd our schools because none of these things were developed with this greater housing density in mind. I guess in your experience as an expert in this area, do most of those arguments hold water? And if so, are there things that jurisdictions can do to address those concerns so that we can both add the housing and also address those issues?
I mean, there's kind of both sides of some of those arguments, right? So when you talk about infrastructure, when you're doing what's called infill development, where it's kind of filling in places that have already been developed, you do have the opportunity to take advantage of existing infrastructure, as opposed to taking on the cost of extending infrastructure and then having to maintain that extended infrastructure. I think, there's also ways in which, for example, multifamily housing is generally more water efficient, for example, than a single family home. Smaller units, people don't have yards to maintain. So I think there's ways in which there are some benefits of a more compact kind of style of development. I also think, I think there's challenges too with, I know traffic comes up a lot in the sense of, more people in a smaller space, but the more people the higher the sort of population density in a place, you also open up more opportunities for walking, biking, public transit service. It's really hard for transit to serve a sort of lower density single family neighborhood. But when there's enough people to sort of support better, say, bus service, then that becomes an opportunity, right? So I think part of the challenge is maybe not all of those things can happen at the same time. And so there's probably some places where it's a bit of a chicken and egg, like the housing comes, maybe there's some traffic challenges. And then the next step is figuring out how to accommodate that new growth. And as you said, sort of plan for how all of those pieces have to fit together.
As a planner, are there tools, formulas, rules of thumb, things that you can do to help ensure that the planning for new housing is more or less equally spread out across a jurisdiction?
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that was emphasized more in this most recent RHNA cycle. So there's a concept called affirmatively furthering fair housing, and that was added to the there's kind of 5 overarching objectives of RHNA, and that was added as an objective, and also as local jurisdictions are doing their housing element, which is where they make those decisions about zoning sites for housing, right? So they're choosing the locations within their community that they're planning for more housing, that the state is really emphasizing this concept, which is essentially trying to overcome patterns of segregation and also sort of open up areas of opportunity to people at all income levels, right? So I think in particular, I think that concept is helping with what you were describing of, maybe not having all the housing in only certain locations, or I think even more specifically, affordable housing only being in certain locations, and trying to make sure that affirmatively furthering fair housing is kind of comes from the idea of making sure that lower income households have access to the parts of a community, the neighborhoods where they have good schools and well-resourced schools and job opportunities and access to transportation and all of that. And so I think that has helped push, jurisdictions to think a little bit more holistically about their whole community, about where housing should go.
Throughout the RHNA process, are there goals for both or targets for both total number of new housing units that have to be planned, and also the number of affordable housing units that have to be planned? Or is it all kind of lumped together just generically as housing units?
It actually has, so the allocation, the way that the RHNA process starts is the state assigns a total number of housing units that each region has to accommodate. And so for the Bay Area, this past cycle, it was about 441,000 units. And when we get that number from the state, it's broken up into 4 different income categories. And so it covers everybody from very low income households all the way up to sort of what they call above moderate income households, which is people that are basically able to afford kind of market rate housing. And so that's how the units get allocated. A jurisdiction receives an allocation of a specific number of units in each of those 4 income categories. And so it is trying to address, again, making sure that we're providing housing units for everybody, not just kind of relying on the market.
In that case, when we're trying to, as you said, affirmatively further for housing, we're trying to open up new opportunities for people at all income levels. Is there some kind of creativity that's required in the planning process to maybe take a well-resourced area where maybe the typical parcel size might be 1/4 of an acre or 1/2 an acre, without completely changing the character of that neighborhood, still somehow try to find opportunities to build or plan for housing for lower income families and lower income households?
I think what you're getting at is a really significant challenge. So some of the things that I mentioned earlier about trying to get, a higher amount of sort of units within the existing space, I think some of that can help, right? So those accessory dwelling units can be more affordable. They aren't always, but they can be. And I think there is a push for, again, every community to try to think about places where, you can fit in more housing. So for example, a place that's predominantly single family homes, maybe they have the ability to put in some smaller apartment buildings, right, that aren't tall structures that are, kind of be a jarring contrast for the people in the community. I guess I would say social equity has always been a component of the RHNA methodology and the RHNA process, and it's one of the desired outcomes and requirements for RHNA. But I think this emphasis on affirmatively furthering fair housing has really been more of a priority, I guess I would say, in this RHNA cycle. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how they try to accommodate that. I think that's part of what everyone's struggling with right now as they're doing their housing elements. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it works out. I think there's funding for affordable housing. Sometimes it's easier to do if there are bigger buildings. And so how does that work when you're trying to kind of fit into the way that the existing pattern of homes is?
How is each jurisdiction's allotment or portion of that 400,000, how is that calculated? Because obviously a city the size of San Jose with 1 million people, I would assume would have a much higher number than a city that's got 30 or 40,000 people.
I guess what I would say is that it's complicated. And so this is the work that ABAG is responsible for, is taking that number that we get from the state and figuring out what the sort of the methodology, and really it comes down to almost a mathematical formula, is for assigning a share of that 441,000 units to each local government. I think if people are interested in how it exactly works, we have a document on the ABAG website that goes into detail about our methodology. But for this cycle, every time we do RENA, it is a bit of a blank slate. There's the rules that we have to follow from the statutory language. And again, they kind of change cycle to cycle a little bit. Some things get added. But the way that ABAG has traditionally done our RENA process is to start by convening what we call a housing methodology committee. And so it's made up of elected officials from cities and towns and counties in the region, as well as local jurisdiction staff, and then a whole suite of different stakeholders from within the region. So people who have backgrounds in housing development, both affordable and market rate, and education and public health and public transit, as a way of helping us work through this process of coming up with the methodology. And so this time, the major components of our methodology are, we start with the forecasted number of households that a jurisdiction will have in the year 2050. So looking at basically taking into account the size of the jurisdiction now. So as you pointed out, San Jose is going to have a very different number than a smaller community. And then it also has factors related to access to high opportunity areas. So that's partly related to that concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing. And then also proximity to jobs through either by taking transit or by driving. So again, trying to think about those travel patterns and wanting to make sure that our housing and jobs are as balanced as possible. And so those were kind of the factors that went into figuring out what number each jurisdiction gets. And so starting with, again, sort of their future population, future expected number of households, and then adjusting them up and down based on how they compared to other jurisdictions in the region on that access to high opportunity areas or job proximity.
As you're calculating each city or each town's obligation, does the past performance figure into that? And so what I mean by that is, you could have one city that has been historically very good about meeting their RENA goals every cycle, and another city that maybe doesn't, or a city that struggles to meet. So then their baseline at the beginning of the next cycle are different. And so is there some way to try to balance that out or take that into consideration so the high performing cities don't continually have to take more and more of the burden because they were good the last time?
That was a conversation that we had with our housing methodology committee members, and they chose not to have a specific factor that kind of took into account past performance. I think there's sometimes jurisdictions, want to use lack of growth as an argument for having a smaller RENA, and that's actually, they recently changed that in state law where that's not allowed. But I do think it would be possible to have something like you said, where if you've done, you are building housing and you've done your part in the past, that you could consider that. But that wasn't part of what our group wanted to do this time.
I'm just curious, prior to 1969, there must have been something happening that led to this state law, that led to this new policy statewide. So do you have any insight into what the history of it was and what drove the creation of RENA in the first place?
I have to say I don't. I don't know if it was just a sort of sense of good planning would be to make sure that you're planning for housing, or if there was some specific event or something that caused it, but I don't know.
Since RENA came into existence roughly 50 years ago ish, can you give us a sense of whether it's been an effective tool for planners around the state, whether it has, if not fully accomplished all of its goals, has it at least helped move us forward and move us closer to getting adequate housing?
I guess what I would say is I think that the process of sort of requiring local governments to consider housing and to, take that step of actually zoning land for new homes has led to increased housing. But I guess I would also say that, the high housing costs in a lot of the regions in California, I think, is evidence that it hasn't been entirely successful. And I think, there's been actually a lot of changes to RENA in the last kind of 5 years or so in terms of trying to fix it and make it more effective and impactful. And I guess one of the changes, that was particularly significant for this cycle was changes to how the state and HCD identify that total number of housing units that we have to plan for. So again, this time it was 441,000, but the last RHNA cycle, it was about 188, I think, right? So now we sort of more than doubled the amount of housing that we have to plan for. And the way that they did that was, it has always been based on sort of a demographic forecast of, the expected number of people who are going to be forming households within the region, either by, people who are born and move, become of an age that they want to form a household, or people moving into the state. And this time they added factors that relate to overcrowded households or households that are paying more than they should be for housing. So cost burden households, as well as kind of a target vacancy rate. And all of those, what I guess I would call sort of symptoms of a housing market that isn't working correctly, led to the increase in the total number of units that the region has to plan for. So I think that's one step that they've taken to, again, try to make RHNA more effective. And I think also that change of emphasizing affirmatively furthering for housing is another way in which they're trying to achieve a more equitable sort of housing pattern in the region. So I guess, it's going to be, as I said, there's a lot of changes that went into this cycle. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what impact they have. Does it help local jurisdictions become more effective at, approving housing units? Or, I think one of the challenges for local governments is they're not entirely in control of whether housing gets built or not, right? So I think RHNA really focuses on trying to make sure that the planning that local governments do and the ways in which they approve development projects is not what's holding development back. But, we have significant challenges related to, our construction workforce, right? There's not actually enough people to build all the housing we need. So I think there's efforts, parallel efforts, I guess I would say, to trying to address some of those issues as well. And I think, one of the biggest challenges is, we have a need for homes that are affordable, which usually requires some sort of public subsidy. And there's just not enough money to go around to achieve the number of truly affordable units that we're looking for. And so I think, hopefully the work that local governments are doing in their housing elements and trying to accommodate RHNA will also spur some extra effort in trying to identify what could be some additional funding sources to make those affordable units happen.
When a city or town is trying to plan for the next RHNA cycle, are they able to count as new units or potential new units conversions? For example, if the hotel is purchased or motel is purchased and converted into an apartment, could those units be counted towards a city's RHNA obligation?
I have to be honest that I don't know all of the rules around that. When it gets to the question of sort of what counts for meeting the RHNA obligation, that's a conversation between the jurisdiction and the state. So state HCD is responsible for both reviewing and confirming that a local jurisdiction's housing element complies with state law, but also tracking their progress over the 8-year cycle. And so I just don't know all the details on what counts.
When cities and towns go through this planning process, do they typically each do it alone? So San Jose does its own, Sunnyvale does its own, et cetera? Or is there any sort of regional collaboration between two cities or multiple cities?
I guess what I would say is for the RHNA process itself, this process of identifying the number of units for every jurisdiction, that's generally a regional process, right? So ABAG is responsible by state law for doing that. But there is an opportunity sort of allowed in state law where jurisdictions can come together and do their own RHNA process. And this cycle, the jurisdictions in Solano County, so all of them and the cities there and the county decided to do their own RHNA process. It's called a subregion. So they did that. And then when it gets to essentially after ABAG's sort of RHNA process is completed and we've assigned a certain number of units to every jurisdiction, ABAG's role, sort of formal role, I guess I would say, in RHNA is done. As I said, then it's sort of jurisdictions working with the state and, finishing their housing element and getting it approved. But we did try this past cycle. There was money provided by the state for what was called the Regional Early Action Planning Program. I think that's the correct term. So REAP money. And we used that to establish sort of housing collaboratives within every county where local jurisdiction staff working on housing elements could come together within a particular county and talk about the issues they're facing and kind of try to learn from one another. There are other, some of those collaboratives really did develop sort of joint work products, right? There's the housing element includes this site inventory, right? So they have to show how they're going to accommodate their RHNA numbers, but it also has a whole very robust analysis of housing conditions in the community, different, what how their population is, what their sort of special populations, housing needs for seniors or people with disabilities. And so I tend to think of it as the site inventory because that's the part that I focus on, but there's a whole lot of really detailed information that jurisdictions have to look at and analyze as they think about what housing solutions their communities need, and then trying to identify specific policies and strategies to accommodate those needs. And so I think it was helpful for jurisdictions to have a space to talk about some of those ideas for, again, thinking about how to meet the needs of their communities.
And are there any consequences if a city fails to meet its RHNA objective each cycle?
I think the one that we mentioned before, so SB 35 is one of the sort of, penalties for if you're not making progress on your RHNA numbers. I think there are other things are tied to whether you get a certified housing element. So there's funding sources, for example, available from the state where you have to have a certified housing element. But I think, to my knowledge, SB 35 is the one that specifically looks at how are you doing on actually meeting your RHNA numbers.
It sounds like you have quite a bit of experience with RHNA, going through multiple cycles of this process. If someone handed you a magic wand and said you could change one thing, anything about this process, what would you do? What one thing would you love to see changed about the RHNA process?
I mean, I guess, so I'm sort of down in the weeds as the person who runs the process. I think one of the challenges is just it's very, very complex. And so I think it's really hard for people to understand sort of how do we come up with these numbers? And again, we have a RHNA methodology document that explains it in detail, but it's, 70 pages long, right? So I guess I just wish there was a way to simplify the process. I think it's important to have the sort of the analysis that goes into it and really sort of a comprehensive thinking about it, but it makes it very hard for us to talk about and for, I think members of the public, I can't imagine that most people really understand what's going on with RHNA, which is a shame. And I think even for the local elected officials who, we try to engage in our process and they're responsible for implementing it, I think I'm sure it seems quite murky, even though we do the best that we can to communicate and, document what we're doing. So yeah, I guess I'm not quite sure how to accomplish that, but it would feel better, I think, if people had a better understanding of how it works.
In your experience, do you find that most cities, most elected officials really do want to comply? They really do want to meet these obligations, and it may be difficult for them at times, but do you get the sense that there is a genuine desire by most people to try to meet these obligations?
I would say that, we have 109 jurisdictions in the Bay Area. And I would say that most of them really do, right? I mean, I think they understand the need. I think it is a challenge. It's not simple. And so I do think that they are invested in trying to find solutions. I think there are some jurisdictions that really aren't, right? They kind of like things the way they are and they would prefer not to have to change. But most, I think, the change is difficult. And so it's hard to figure out the path forward. But I think that a lot of jurisdictions really do want to try to find a solution. I just think that sometimes the solutions are harder than they thought they would be. And so that's where it gets challenging.
Well, Gillian, this has been enlightening, eye-opening. As someone who works in a housing department, so I'm hearing about this stuff constantly. There's just still so much I didn't know. And and you've illuminated a lot, so I appreciate that. Or do you have any parting thoughts, anything else you'd like to say that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to share with our audience?
Honestly, what I would say is for folks who like you, like local housing staff who have had to go through this RHNA cycle and work on housing elements. I have not been down in the weeds with them on that part, but I know it's been extremely challenging. And I guess I want to say, give a shout out to them and express appreciation, because I think, I do think that the RHNA process, I think we're better off having RHNA than not having RHNA, but I think it's getting really complicated, and I just appreciate the work that they do.
Thanks so much, Gillian, for joining me on today's episode. Thanks for listening to Dwellings, the City of San Jose Housing Department podcast. Our theme music is Speed City, composed and performed by Attain Charles. Thanks to San Jose Jazz for letting us use their music. If you like the show, please subscribe and share with your friends and family. If you're looking for more ways to help address housing and homelessness issues in San Jose, please check out the show notes. You can follow the Housing Department on social media. We're on Twitter and Facebook at SJ City Housing. And if you have questions or comments about today's episode, please send them to housingcoms@sanjoseca.gov. The artwork on our website was created by Chelsea Palacio. Dwellings is produced by me, Jeff Scott, and Jose Chavez of the Housing Department.